By 1914, Europe stood divided into two rival blocs. On one side, the Triple Entente united France, Britain, and Russia, drawn together by a common fear of Germany's growing dominance. Facing them was the Triple Alliance Germany, anxious about being boxed in by enemies on all sides, Austria-Hungary, struggling to hold its fragile empire together, and Italy, eyeing potential gains at France's cost. Everything changed on June 28th, in the city of Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a 19-year-old Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip. Convinced Serbia had a hand in the plot, Austria-Hungary responded with an ultimatum full of humiliating conditions. Serbia refused to bow to it, and within hours of declaring war, Austro-Hungarian guns were already bombarding Belgrade. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, feeling honor-bound to protect Serbia as a fellow Slavic nation, called for his army to mobilize. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, having already promised Austria-Hungary his backing, saw a clash with Russia as inevitable and believed it was better to fight now than wait for Russia to grow stronger. Using Russia's mobilization as justification, Germany mobilized its own forces and quickly declared war in return. Germany knew that if it went to war with Russia, France would join the fight because the two nations were allies. To avoid getting trapped in a two-front war, Germany depended on the Schlieffen Plan, a lightning-fast march through neutral Belgium to surround and destroy the French army near Paris, win quickly in the west, and then shift its full attention east toward the slower mobilizing Russians. Germany declared war on France, and within days, 6 million men were marching into battle across Europe. Italy decided to stay out of the conflict because the Triple Alliance only required it to fight in a defensive war, not an offensive one. The United States also remained neutral, as neither President Wilson nor the American public wanted to be pulled into another European war. Britain's position remained uncertain at first, despite its alliance with France. But everything changed when German troops marched into Belgium, a nation whose neutrality Britain had pledged to defend. London immediately issued an ultimatum demanding Germany withdraw its forces. Berlin refused to comply, and Britain officially declared war. Soon after, the British Expeditionary Force arrived in France. While the determined Belgian defenders at the fortress city of Liège delayed the German advance, giving the Allies valuable time to prepare. During the invasion, German troops carried out several massacres of Belgian civilians, and Allied propaganda amplified these events even further, turning neutral opinion sharply against Germany. Completely unaware of the massive German encirclement unfolding around them, France launched its own offensive under Plan V, advancing into German territory. Instead, the Battle of the Frontiers became a devastating bloodbath, with both armies suffering enormous casualties before the French were forced to retreat. The British Expeditionary Force soon met German troops at Mons. But heavily outnumbered, they too had no choice but to fall back alongside the French. The Allies made their final stand at the River Marne, only 40 miles from Paris. A desperate counterattack there saved the French capital and forced the Germans to retreat, though the victory came at an enormous cost, with both sides losing nearly 250,000 men. What came next became known as the Race to the Sea, as both armies raced north, each trying to outflank the other before it was too late. This fierce struggle reached its peak at the First Battle of Ypres, where the Allies barely managed to hold their ground and prevent a German breakthrough, though the victory came at an enormous cost for both sides. In the end, neither army could break through, so they dug deep trenches along a 350-mile front, taking shelter from relentless machine gun fire and constant artillery bombardments. The brutal era of trench warfare had officially begun. At sea, British warships scored the war's first major naval victory at Heligoland Bight, sinking 3 German cruisers. Possessing the world's most powerful navy, with 29 modern battleships compared to Germany's 19, Britain quickly imposed a blockade, cutting off contraband supplies, including food, in an effort to starve Germany's economy into submission. But only a week later, The British cruiser Pathfinder became the first ship in history to be sunk by a submarine-launched torpedo. German U-boats, able to strike without warning from beneath the waves and travel up to 9,000 miles, suddenly emerged as a dangerous new challenge to Britain's command of the seas. Far to the east, Russian armies invaded East Prussia, only to suffer a devastating defeat at the Battle of Tannenberg. There, General Paul von Hindenburg and his chief of staff, Erich Ludendorff, engineered a remarkable German victory, capturing 90,000 prisoners and completely destroying an entire Russian army. The disaster became even worse because Russia had recklessly transmitted military orders through uncoded radio messages. Another crushing German triumph at the Masurian Lakes forced the Russians into yet another retreat. Within only 6 weeks, Russia had lost nearly 1/3 soldiers. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary's invasion of Serbia ended in humiliating defeat at the Battle of Sur, while its offensive against Russia also collapsed, costing more than 300,000 men. The fortress town of Przemysl soon found itself surrounded by Russian forces, forcing Germany to launch a diversionary attack toward Warsaw. That decision sparked brutal winter fighting near the Polish city of D. But after weeks of bitter combat, neither side managed to gain a decisive advantage. Elsewhere, the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers, declaring war on its longtime rival. Russia-Turkish warships bombarded the Russian ports of Odessa and Sevastopol, while Russian troops advanced across the border into the Caucasus. Beyond Europe, the war quickly spread across the world's oceans and distant colonies. German troops crossed into British East Africa and captured Tveta, while Allied forces successfully seized the German colony of Togoland. However, British attacks against German Cameroon were beaten back at Garua and Sanakong, and a 3,000-man British force invading German Southwest Africa was captured at Saint-Fontaine. Just a month later, another British invasion at Tonga ended in complete chaos after a much smaller German force led by Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck crushed the attack. Cut off from Germany, Lettow-Vorbeck would continue fighting an incredibly successful guerrilla campaign that kept massive numbers of Allied troops tied down for years. In Asia, Japan honored its alliance with Britain by declaring war on Germany and capturing the German naval base at Qingdao. Germany's colonies in Samoa and New Guinea also surrendered to New Zealand and Australian forces. But in the Pacific, off the coast of Chile, Admiral Maximilian von Spee's German squadron destroyed 2 British cruisers during the Battle of Coronel, with every sailor aboard both ships killed. Just 5 weeks later, however, von Spee encountered a powerful British fleet near the Falkland Islands, where 4 of his 5 cruisers were sunk, and the admiral himself went down with his flagship. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, British troops captured the Ottoman port of Basra, securing access to the valuable Persian oil that fueled the British fleet. That winter, Austrian troops finally captured Belgrade, only to lose it again when Serbian forces launched a successful counterattack. By then, the fighting in Serbia had already cost both sides around 200,000 casualties each. In the North Sea, German warships carried out a surprise hit-and-run raid on the English coastal towns of Hartlepool, Whitby, and Scarborough, killing more than 100 civilians with heavy shelling. On the Western Front, France launched its first major offensive of the war. But the First Battle of Champagne achieved only limited gains while costing nearly 90,000 casualties. In the Caucasus, an Ottoman offensive through the snow-covered mountains during the heart of winter ended in disaster at Sarikamish, where 60,000 Turkish soldiers were lost, many freezing to death. Yet amid all the destruction, that first Christmas saw an extraordinary moment, as soldiers in some parts of the Western Front called a brief truce and even played football together in no man's land. By January 1915, the war was only 5 months old, yet nearly 1 million soldiers had already lost their lives. What had started as a regional dispute in the Balkans had exploded into a global conflict. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, now stood against the Allies, Britain, France, Russia, Serbia, Montenegro, Belgium, and Japan. Across Poland and the Baltic region, Russia had suffered one crushing defeat after another, but continued resisting German and Austro-Hungarian armies. Austria-Hungary had also endured devastating losses and faced humiliation after failing to defeat Serbia. In the freezing Caucasus Mountains, Russian and Ottoman forces battled through brutal winter conditions, while along the Western Front, French, British, and Belgian troops remained locked in trenches facing the Germans across a battle line stretching from the English Channel all the way to Switzerland. As part of the world's first strategic bombing campaign, Germany launched Zeppelin airships against Britain, targeting the ports of King's Lynn and Great Yarmouth. The raids damaged homes and claimed the lives of 4 civilians. At sea, the British Navy sank a German cruiser during the Battle of Doggerbank, although the rest of the German squadron managed to escape. With Britain continuing to enforce its powerful naval blockade, Germany responded by declaring the waters around the British Isles an active war zone, warning that U-boats would attack Allied merchant ships without any warning. Since Britain relied heavily on imported food, Germany hoped this strategy would starve the nation into surrender. On the Eastern Front, Field Marshal von Hindenburg launched a powerful winter offensive that dealt Russia another crushing defeat at the Second Battle of Masurian Lakes. Russia lost as many as 200,000 soldiers, with nearly half surrendering in the brutal freezing conditions. However, Russia achieved greater success against Austria-Hungary, recapturing Przemysl after a 4-month siege and taking 100,000 prisoners. By this stage of the war, Austria-Hungary's total casualties had risen to an astonishing 2 million. Meanwhile, British and French warships entered the Dardanelles, hoping to threaten Constantinople and force the Ottoman Empire into a swift surrender. They heavily bombarded Turkish coastal forts guarding the narrow straits, but after losing 3 battleships to naval mines and seeing 3 more badly damaged, the attack had to be abandoned. On the Western Front, British forces launched an assault at Neuve-Chapelle, only to be halted by German barbed wire and relentless machine gun fire. British and Indian troops suffered around 11,000 casualties, nearly 1/4 of the entire attacking force. Just 6 weeks later, at the Second Battle of Ypres, Germany introduced poison gas to the Western Front for the very first time. A deadly cloud of chlorine gas forced Allied soldiers to abandon their trenches, but Germany lacked enough reserve troops to fully exploit the breakthrough. Both sides quickly rushed to issue crude gas masks as the world's first chemical arms race began. The Allies then launched a ground invasion at Gallipoli, with Australian and New Zealand troops, the Anzacs, among the soldiers landing on the beaches. Their mission was to capture the coastal forts, blocking Allied warships from reaching Constantinople. Instead, fierce Turkish resistance pinned them down almost as soon as they came ashore. Just 1 day before these landings, the Ottoman Empire began the systematic deportation and mass killing of ethnic Armenians, a minority that had long faced persecution and was now accused of helping Turkey's enemies. Hundreds of thousands were forced on death marches into the Syrian desert, where many were left to perish. In total, more than 1 million Armenians lost their lives. The Allied powers condemned the atrocities as a crime against humanity and promised to hold those responsible accountable. Even today, however, the Turkish government continues to dispute both the estimated death toll and the description of these events as genocide. On the Eastern Front, a joint German and Austro-Hungarian offensive in Galicia smashed through Russian defenses, recapturing Przemysl and taking another 100,000 prisoners. It marked the beginning of a relentless advance that pushed Russian forces steadily backward. At sea, the British ocean liner Lusitania, sailing from New York to Liverpool, was suddenly torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland without any warning. Nearly 1,200 passengers and crew lost their lives, including 128 Americans, triggering widespread outrage from President Wilson and the American public. Germany defended the attack by insisting the ship had been transporting military supplies for Britain. That May, the Allies launched the Second Battle of Artois, in yet another effort to break through the German defenses. The French concentrated their main assault on Vimy Ridge, while the British supported them with attacks at Aubers Ridge and Festubert. After all the fighting, the offensive cost the Allies 130,000 casualties in exchange for only a few thousand yards of ground. That summer, Germany gained control of the skies over the Western Front with the arrival of the Fokker Eindecker fighter. It was one of the first aircraft fitted with a machine gun that could fire directly through its propeller, using the newly developed interrupter gear. Allied aircraft losses quickly soared during what became known as the Fokker Scourge. Italy, lured by British and French promises of Austro-Hungarian territory, joined the Allies and declared war on Austria-Hungary, later extending its declaration to the Ottoman Empire and Germany. Italian forces launched their first offensive along the Isonzo River, but were driven back after suffering heavy losses. Meanwhile, the Allies watched the Eastern Front fall into crisis as Russia began a full-scale retreat, abandoning Poland. German troops marched into Warsaw on August 5. In response, Tsar Nicholas II removed his commander-in-chief, Grand Duke Nicholas, and assumed personal command of the army himself, a decision that would later prove disastrous by linking him directly to Russia's growing military failures. At Gallipoli, the Allies landed fresh reinforcements at Suvla Bay, but neither these troops nor renewed Anzac assaults were able to break the deadlock. Conditions on the peninsula were miserable for both armies, as soldiers fought not only each other, but also scorching heat, swarms of flies, and deadly disease. Meanwhile, in the Atlantic, a German U-boat sank the passenger liner SS Arabic, killing 44 people, including 3 Americans. Facing increasing pressure from Washington, Germany agreed to stop attacking passenger ships. On the Western Front, the Allies launched their biggest offensive of the war so far, hoping to reduce the pressure on their struggling Russian ally. The French attacked during the Third Battle of Artois and the Second Battle of Champagne, while the British used poison gas in their assault at Loos. Although the attacks achieved some early success, the advances soon stalled, and casualties rose dramatically on every side. Allied troops also landed at Salonika in Greece to open a new front and help Serbia, but they arrived too late. Bulgaria entered the war alongside the Central Powers, and together they overwhelmed Serbia in just 2 months. That winter, the surviving Serbian army endured a heartbreaking retreat across the Albanian mountains. By the end of the war, nearly 1/3 of Serbia's army had been killed, giving it the highest casualty rate of any nation involved. Fierce fighting continued on the Italian front as Italian troops launched the third and fourth battles of the Isonzo. Although they greatly outnumbered their opponents, the Austro-Hungarian army held powerful defensive positions on the surrounding high ground, making them almost impossible to dislodge. In the Middle East, a British advance toward Baghdad was halted by Turkish forces at the Battle of Ctesiphon, only 25 miles from the city, forcing the British to retreat to Kut, where they were quickly surrounded and placed under siege. The Allies eventually abandoned the Gallipoli campaign entirely, secretly evacuating 83,000 troops without losing a single soldier during the withdrawal, one of the most brilliantly executed operations of the entire war. By the end of the campaign, both sides had suffered a combined 250,000 casualties. The year 1915 had been devastating for the Allies, bringing enormous losses with almost nothing to show in return. Yet instead of seeking peace, both sides spent the winter preparing for even larger offensives in 1916, using new tactics shaped by the painful lessons of the previous year. Despite everything, military leaders on both sides still believed that one decisive victory on the battlefield could finally end the war. When World War I began, many believed it would be short, glorious, and quickly won. But by 1916, modern industrial warfare had already driven the death toll into the millions, with no end in sight. Naval blockades were beginning to create severe shortages of food and fuel across Europe, while thousands of women had entered factories and workplaces to replace the men serving on the front lines. Every nation was now preparing for a long and exhausting war. By this point, the conflict had raged for a year and a half, with the Allies still fighting the Central Powers, now strengthened by the addition of Bulgaria. At sea, Britain continued enforcing its blockade of Germany, cutting off food and critical raw materials, while Germany was forced to limit its U-boat campaign against Britain to avoid provoking the still neutral United States, whose citizens had already become victims of the conflict. On the Western Front, French, British, and Belgian soldiers remained trapped in the deadly stalemate of trench warfare against German forces. On the Eastern Front, Russia had finally stabilized its defenses after its long retreat, although its army had suffered devastating losses. Along the Italian front, repeated Italian offensives against heavily fortified Austro-Hungarian positions had ended in one costly failure after another. While in the Balkans, Serbia had been conquered, and its surviving army forced into a painful retreat across the mountains of Albania. On January 5th, Austro-Hungarian forces invaded Montenegro. They were briefly delayed at the Battle of Moshkovac, but just 3 weeks later, Montenegro was forced to surrender. On the Caucasus front, Russia launched a surprise winter offensive against the Ottoman Empire, capturing the city of Erzurum 6 weeks later and the important Black Sea port of Trebizond that April. Meanwhile, in Africa, the British transported 2 motorboats an incredible 10,000 miles by sea and land to Lake Tanganyika, where they helped seize control of the strategically important lake from German forces. During the same month, German troops who had defended Mora Mountain in Cameroon under siege for 18 months finally surrendered, bringing the long Cameroon campaign to an end. On the Western Front, Germany launched a massive assault on the French fortress town of Verdun. German General Erich von Falkenhayn believed France would defend this deeply symbolic city to the very last soldier, and his plan, in his own chilling words, was to bleed France white. It was a strategy based entirely on wearing the enemy down through relentless attrition. Verdun soon became one of the most terrifying battles of the entire war, a brutal killing ground where entire divisions were wiped out almost as quickly as they were sent into combat. In Britain, more than 1 million men had already volunteered to serve, but the government realized volunteers alone would never be enough and introduced compulsory military service, becoming the last major power to adopt conscription. That spring, British soldiers finally received steel helmets, making them the last major army to issue this vital protection. Trench warfare had created an alarming number of head injuries, and although the German Stahlhelm, the French Adrian helmet, and the British Mark I helmet offered only limited protection, they greatly reduced deaths caused by shrapnel and exploding shell fragments. Neutral Portugal had been quietly working alongside Britain, hoping the partnership would help protect its African colony of Angola. On March 9th, Germany responded by declaring war on Portugal. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Russia launched an offensive near Lake Narok in an attempt to ease the pressure on French forces defending Verdun. Instead, the attack ended in disaster, costing Russia 100,000 casualties while failing to draw even a single German unit away from Verdun. In Dublin, Irish Republicans launched an armed rebellion against British rule, an uprising that became known as the Easter Rising. After 6 days of fierce fighting, the revolt was crushed. In the Middle East, British forces trapped at Kut finally surrendered after enduring a 5-month siege. General Charles Townshend led 9,000 British and Indian soldiers into captivity, and nearly half of them would later die from starvation or disease. Hoping to win Arab support against the Ottoman Empire, Britain had promised Arab leaders an independent state after the war. But behind closed doors, Britain and France secretly signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, dividing the Middle East into future British and French spheres of control. Completely unaware of this secret deal, Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, launched the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, and successfully captured the holy city of Mecca. On the Italian front, Austro-Hungarian forces launched a surprise offensive at Asiago, breaking through Italian defenses and threatening to advance deep into northern Italy. During that same month, in the North Sea, the German High Seas Fleet confronted the British Grand Fleet in the Battle of Jutland, the only major naval battle fought during the entire war. Although Britain suffered greater losses, it was widely considered the victor because the German fleet retreated back to port and never again challenged British naval supremacy for the remainder of the conflict. For the summer of 1916, the Allies had planned massive offensives on both the eastern and western fronts, a strategy that became even more urgent as they tried to relieve the crushing pressure on the French at Verdun and the Italians at Asiago. Russia struck first. General Alexei Brusilov, having carefully kept his plans secret, shattered the enemy's defenses and advanced as far as 60 miles in some sectors, capturing 200,000 prisoners. Although the offensive came at a heavy cost, its success forced the Central Powers to pull troops away from other fronts to stop their collapsing lines. At sea, the British cruiser Hampshire struck a mine and sank off the coast of Orkney while sailing to Russia, killing 650 people, including Britain's famous Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener. Just 3 days later, in the Adriatic Sea, the Italian troop ship Principe Umberto was sunk by a German submarine, taking 1,900 lives in the deadliest single sinking of the entire war on the Western Front. Britain and France launched their long-awaited summer offensive, the Battle of the Somme. Hopes for a decisive breakthrough were incredibly high, but the opening day ended in disaster. After a massive artillery bombardment failed to destroy the German defenses, waves of British infantry advanced into no man's land, only to be cut down by relentless machine gun fire. Within just a few hours, Britain suffered 57,000 casualties, with 1/3 of those soldiers killed, the bloodiest single day in the history of the British Army. Despite the horrific losses, the offensive continued, and the battle would rage on for another 5 exhausting months. Inspired by Russia's early success, Romania entered the war on the Allied side. Its first invasion of Transylvania made promising progress, but it was soon met by a powerful counteroffensive from German, Bulgarian, and Austro-Hungarian forces. At the same time, the Allied army at Salonika attempted to support Romania by advancing toward Monastir. Serbian troops led the attack and managed to make limited progress, but determined Bulgarian resistance prevented any major breakthrough. On the Western Front, General von Falkenhayn finally ended the assault on Verdun. The French army had fulfilled the promise of their commander, General Robert Nivelle, "Ils ne passeront pas," they shall not pass. But the victory came at an unimaginable price. France suffered 365,000 casualties, while Germany lost almost the same number. Verdun remains one of the deadliest battles ever fought in human history. Blamed for the failure, Falkenhayn was removed from command, and Germany's celebrated Eastern Front commanders, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, were placed in charge of the war in the West. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Somme continued to rage. Near the village of Flers, Britain unveiled a revolutionary new weapon designed to break the deadly trench stalemate: the tank. Although it showed real potential, the first tanks were too few in number and too unreliable to change the course of the battle. On the Eastern Front, Russia's Brusilov offensive finally came to an end. While casualty estimates differ greatly, one thing was certain: both armies had suffered devastating losses, and neither the Russian nor the Austro-Hungarian army would ever fully recover. Along the Italian front, fierce fighting continued throughout the autumn as Italian forces launched repeated and costly attacks against Austro-Hungarian positions along the Isonzo River. The Battle of the Somme finally came to an end in cold autumn rain and deep mud. After months of brutal fighting, the Allies had advanced only 10 miles, while suffering 600,000 casualties, with Germany losing around 450,000 men. Even so, Allied leaders convinced themselves the strategy was working, believing that Germany would eventually run out of soldiers before they did. Meanwhile, Romania suffered a crushing defeat as the Central Powers overran the country, inflicting around 250,000 casualties on its army. The surviving Romanian troops withdrew and joined the Russians on the Eastern Front that winter, brought major political changes across Europe. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, who had ruled since 1848, died and was succeeded by his son Karl in Britain. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith was forced from office and replaced by David Lloyd George while in France. General Joseph Joffre was removed as commander-in-chief and replaced by General Nivelle, who confidently promised victory through bold and aggressive tactics. Amid all these dramatic changes, President Wilson continued trying to negotiate a peace settlement. But his efforts failed because neither side was willing to make any meaningful compromise. By 1916, the war had transformed into a brutal struggle of pure attrition. Instead of chasing decisive battlefield victories, both sides now focused on wearing each other down until the enemy simply had no strength left to continue fighting. In 1917, that grim strategy would push Europe's greatest powers closer to collapse than ever before. Germany understood it could never win a long war of attrition against the resource-rich Allied nations, so its leaders made a huge gamble. They resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, believing their U-boats could cut Britain's food supply and force the country to surrender within 6 months. But this shoot-on-sight policy meant neutral American ships would almost certainly become targets as well, increasing the risk of bringing the United States into the war on the Allied side. Just 2 days after the campaign began, the American steamer SS Lusitania, carrying wheat from Texas to England, was sunk by a German U-boat. Soon afterward, Britain handed the United States an intercepted message from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to Germany's ambassador in Mexico, urging Mexico to attack the United States if America entered the war against Germany. The infamous Zimmermann telegram placed even greater pressure on President Wilson to take action. In Russia, growing casualties and worsening bread shortages triggered widespread riots that eventually exploded into revolution. The Tsar was forced to abdicate, and a provisional government took power, promising to continue the war. But on the front lines, Russian soldiers had lost the will to fight and began deserting in massive numbers. After a series of German provocations, the United States finally declared war on Germany, bringing its enormous industrial and military strength to the Allied side, although it would take several months before American forces were fully ready for combat. In the meantime, Germany's submarine strategy appeared to be working. That April, German U-boats sank 886,000 tons of Allied shipping, averaging 17 ships every single day, each carrying desperately needed food and supplies. Britain now faced the terrifying possibility of starvation unless the U-boat threat could be stopped. On the Western Front, Britain launched the Battle of Arras as a diversion to support a much larger French offensive that was about to begin. After intense fighting, Canadian troops captured the strategic high ground at Vimy Ridge. Although it was an important victory, it came at a terrible price, costing the Allies 150,000 casualties, while Germany lost around 130,000 men. Meanwhile, the air war had become far more advanced and far more deadly. Reconnaissance aircraft played a vital role in locating enemy positions and directing artillery fire, while fighter planes battled to shoot them down before they could complete their missions. New aircraft designs appeared every few months, and that spring, Germany's dominance in the skies caused devastating Allied losses during what became known as Bloody April. Just 3 days after the capture of Vimy Ridge, French General Robert Nivelle launched his long-awaited main offensive. Expectations were incredibly high, but after some early gains, the advance ground to a halt as casualties mounted on both sides. The seemingly meaningless slaughter shattered morale throughout the French army. Entire units mutinied and refused to launch further attacks. Nivelle was dismissed as commander-in-chief and replaced by General Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun, who promised there would be no more reckless offensives that sacrificed thousands of lives for almost no gain. That summer, at Messines Ridge, British troops secretly dug tunnels beneath the German lines and detonated 19 enormous mines under their positions. At the time, it was the largest man-made explosion ever created, helping the British secure a brilliant, though limited, victory. In Greece, King Constantine, who had favored remaining neutral, was forced to abdicate, and Greece officially joined the Allies. Soon afterward, Russia's provisional government ordered one final offensive, but the July offensive ended in complete disaster. The morale and discipline of the Russian army had completely fallen apart, and when the Central Powers launched their counterattack, they faced almost no resistance at all. At sea, the Allies began grouping merchant ships into heavily protected convoys, and shipping losses started falling steadily. For the first time, the tide of the U-boat war was beginning to turn in the Allies' favor. As frustration and unrest spread across Germany, the Reichstag passed a peace resolution calling for reconciliation and an end to the conflict. But Germany's military leaders, who by then effectively ruled the country like a dictatorship, simply ignored it. In Belgium, Britain launched its biggest offensive of 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres, better known today as Passchendaele. Constant artillery bombardments, relentless rain, and destroyed irrigation systems transformed the battlefield into a vast sea of thick mud, causing any hope of a breakthrough to disappear almost immediately. After 3 months of horrific fighting, the offensive was finally abandoned, leaving Britain with 240,000 casualties and Germany with around 200,000. On the Italian front, the 11th Battle of the Isonzo pushed both the Italian and Austro-Hungarian armies to their limits, ending with roughly 150,000 Italian and 100,000 Austro-Hungarian casualties. That year, even more nations joined the Allied side as Brazil, Liberia, China, and Siam all declared war on Germany, either in response to German U-boat attacks or in hopes of strengthening their ties with the Allies. China would later contribute thousands of laborers who supported Allied military operations across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. In the Middle East, British forces erased the memory of their earlier defeat at Kut by defeating the Ottoman army and marching triumphantly into Baghdad. British troops advancing from Egypt crossed the Sinai Desert, but were turned back by Ottoman forces during the First and Second Battles of Gaza. That July, Arab rebels captured the strategically important Ottoman port of Aqaba with the help of a British officer, Captain T.E. Lawrence, who would later become famous as Lawrence of Arabia. That autumn, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour issued the Balfour Declaration, announcing support for the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. The declaration was intended to strengthen Jewish support for the Allied cause, even though it conflicted with earlier promises Britain had made to Arab leaders. In October, British forces finally captured Gaza, opening the road into Palestine, and just 6 weeks later, General Edmund Allenby marched into Jerusalem, bringing 4 centuries of Ottoman rule to an end. With Russia's armies falling into complete disorder, Germany was able to shift large numbers of troops from the Eastern Front to the Italian front. At the Battle of Caporetto, German and Austro-Hungarian forces shattered the Italian defenses, advancing nearly 70 miles and capturing 250,000 prisoners. The crushing defeat forced Britain and France to send desperately needed divisions away from the Western Front to prevent Italy from collapsing completely. In Russia, a second revolution brought Lenin's Bolshevik Party to power, and Lenin was determined to take Russia out of the war once and for all. In France, Georges Clemenceau, famously known as the Tiger, became prime minister, promising nothing less than total war and total victory. But by the end of 1917, an Allied victory seemed anything but certain. Russia had abandoned the fight, the French army was still recovering from widespread mutinies, and the Italian front had come dangerously close to collapse. American reinforcements were still months away, leaving Britain as the only major Allied power fully capable of continuing the war. Determined to seize the initiative, Britain attacked at Cambrai, launching the first large-scale tank assault in history. On the opening day, nearly 400 tanks smashed through German defenses and advanced several miles, but mechanical failures and heavy losses soon brought the attack to a halt. German reinforcements quickly arrived, and the hard-earned gains were eventually lost. Finland declared its independence from Russia. Romania, now cut off after Russia's collapse, signed an armistice with the Central Powers, and just 6 days later, Russia followed, bringing the Allied Eastern Front to an official end. The year 1917 had cost the Allies one great power, Russia. But it had also gained them a powerful new ally in the United States. Realizing that only a decisive military victory could prevent defeat by the Allies' overwhelming resources, Germany began preparing one final massive offensive for the spring of 1918. By 1918, after 3.5 years of relentless war, the Allies faced one of their darkest moments. Revolution had swept through Russia, and the new Bolshevik government had signed an armistice with the Central Powers, allowing Germany to transfer thousands of experienced troops to the Western Front, where trench warfare had already claimed more than 1 million lives. But Germany itself was also running out of time. Britain's naval blockade had created severe shortages of food and essential supplies, fueling unrest at home, while America's entry into the war was bringing fresh soldiers and enormous resources to the Allied cause. Unless Germany could achieve a rapid victory in the West, defeat seemed almost unavoidable. President Wilson introduced his famous 14 points, presenting his vision for the world after the war. His plan called for an end to secret treaties, smaller standing armies, the right of self-determination for the peoples of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the creation of a new international organization to peacefully settle future disputes. Most European leaders, however, dismissed Wilson's ideas as unrealistic and hopelessly idealistic. At Brest-Litovsk, Bolshevik Russia signed a peace treaty with the Central Powers, giving up vast areas of territory in exchange for peace. The agreement freed nearly 500,000 German troops to move from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, where General Erich Ludendorff was preparing one final, all-or-nothing offensive to win the war. His spring offensive caught the Allies completely by surprise. Using bold infiltration tactics, German stormtroopers smashed through the British Fifth Army, forcing it into a full-scale retreat. As the German advance threatened to split the British and French armies apart, French General Ferdinand Foch was appointed Supreme Allied Commander to coordinate the Allied war effort. Near Amiens, British and Australian troops hastily organized a defensive line and finally brought the German advance to a halt. Ludendorff then shifted the offensive north toward the Channel ports, but once again, the British inflicted heavy losses and blocked any major breakthrough. In the skies, the air war continued to grow more intense, with both sides now deploying over 3,000 aircraft on the Western Front. By 1918, however, the Allies had gained air superiority thanks to their greater industrial strength and resources. On April 21st, Germany's most famous pilot, Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron, was shot down and killed near Amiens. With 80 confirmed aerial victories, he was the highest-scoring fighter ace of the war, and the Allies honored him with a full military funeral. Soon afterward, Britain's newly formed independent bombing force launched a daylight bombing raid on Cologne, marking the beginning of Britain's own strategic bombing campaign. On the ground, Ludendorff redirected his offensive toward the French positions. German forces advanced 30 miles before being stopped at the River Marne, just as fresh American divisions began arriving at the front. The U.S. 1st Division entered combat for the first time at the Battle of Cantigny, and only 3 days later, the U.S. 2nd Division secured an important victory at Belleau Wood. By then, nearly 1 million American soldiers had reached France, with another 10,000 arriving every single day. The fourth phase of the German offensive gained another 9 miles before a determined French counterattack finally brought it to a stop. In Italy, Austria-Hungary launched a new offensive at Asiago and along the Piave River to support Ludendorff's campaign in France, but the attack was beaten back after suffering heavy losses. The defeat shattered what remained of morale within the Austro-Hungarian army. Meanwhile, British and French troops landed at Murmansk in northern Russia, beginning the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War in support of the anti-Bolshevik White forces. On the Western Front, Germany's final offensive came to an end with defeat at the Second Battle of the Marne. Ludendorff's campaign had cost Germany more than 600,000 casualties without delivering the decisive breakthrough it desperately needed. Germany's last great gamble had failed. The Allies immediately seized the initiative. At the Battle of Amiens, British, Australian, Canadian, and French forces, supported by tanks and aircraft, advanced an astonishing 7 miles in a single day. Ludendorff later described August 8th as the Black Day of the German army, as exhausted, hungry, and demoralized German soldiers began surrendering in their thousands. Amiens marked the beginning of the Allies' famous 100 Days offensive. The era of trench warfare was effectively over, and the German army had begun its long retreat. In the Balkans, a new Allied offensive at Dobro Pole smashed through the Bulgarian defenses, and the exhausted Bulgarian army quickly collapsed, leading to an armistice just 2 weeks later. In the Middle East, British-led forces delivered a crushing defeat to the Ottoman army at the Battle of Megiddo, capturing 25,000 prisoners before advancing to occupy Damascus and Aleppo. On the Western Front, Marshal Ferdinand Foch ordered a massive general offensive, and British, French, and American forces broke through the heavily fortified Hindenburg Line. Realizing the war could no longer be won, General Ludendorff informed the Kaiser that Germany's military position was hopeless and urged him to seek an armistice. Germany's peace request was sent to President Wilson, who insisted that Germany first withdraw completely from all occupied territory, and that the Kaiser abdicate the throne on the Italian front. The Allies delivered the final blow to Austria-Hungary at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. The Austro-Hungarian army completely fell apart, with 300,000 soldiers taken prisoner. As the Central Powers collapsed one after another, the Ottoman Empire signed an armistice with the Allies at Mudros, and only 4 days later, Austria-Hungary did the same at Villa Giusti. Meanwhile, at Kiel, the German High Seas Fleet received orders to launch one final suicidal attack against the British Navy. Instead of obeying, the sailors mutinied, and revolution quickly spread throughout Germany. Soon afterward, the Kaiser abdicated, and a new German Republic was proclaimed. On November 11, 1918, a German delegation signed an armistice with the Allies inside Marshal Foch's railway carriage at Compiègne. The ceasefire officially came into effect at 11 a.m., although fierce fighting continued until the very last minute. At 10:59, American Private Henry Gunther was killed while charging a German machine gun position, and he is widely believed to have been the final soldier to die in the war. 3 days later, in East Africa, German General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck finally surrendered his forces along the Chambezi River. For 4 long years, completely cut off from Germany, he had tied down huge numbers of Allied troops while never suffering defeat, earning a lasting reputation as one of history's greatest guerrilla commanders. After the fighting ended, the Paris Peace Conference opened at the Palace of Versailles, just outside the French capital. The delegates agreed to create the League of Nations, an international organization designed to help prevent future wars by peacefully resolving disputes between nations. The Treaty of Versailles, signed that June, imposed extremely harsh terms on Germany. Its military was drastically reduced. It was ordered to pay massive war reparations. Large areas of its territory were handed over to neighboring countries, and all of its overseas colonies were taken by the victorious powers. Germany was also forced to accept full responsibility for the war through the treaty's war guilt clause, a decision that left deep resentment throughout the country. The map of Europe was completely redrawn after the war. Poland returned as an independent nation after more than a century of foreign rule, while Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and a larger Romania emerged from the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled entirely, and new states, most placed under European control, were created across the Middle East, planting the seeds of future conflicts much like those that had already reshaped Europe. Meanwhile, in East Asia, Germany's former territories in China were transferred to Japan, sparking widespread anger and protests across China. World War I claimed the lives of around 9.5 million soldiers, roughly 1 out of every 8 people who fought. Another 21 million soldiers were wounded, while 7 million civilians also lost their lives. Vast regions of Europe were left devastated and in ruins. Ancient empires had disappeared, new nations had risen from their ashes, and millions of lives across the world had been changed forever. From that moment on, the world would never be the same again.